All right, it's just turned 12, so in order to try and make sure you all get to lunch on time, I'll start. Thanks all for coming along. My name is Ben Dechrai. I work for Auth0, and today I want to talk to you about why you shouldn't care about security, which is probably a really weird principle. Like, isn't that what we're all supposed to care about? But I think you shouldn't, and I'll tell you why. But first, a little bit about me. So I'm a software engineer from way back when. I started coding in PHP in 1999 when it was still version 3. Does anybody here remember version 3? Those are the days. Oh my God, object orientation, who needs that, right? So I started in PHP. I worked for digital agencies and then for product companies, and I eventually moved to Australia, where I started finding out a lot more about communities. I didn't know about meetups back when I was in London. But then I got to Australia and I started doing more community stuff, running some meetups, and really enjoyed getting to know people and chat to them, and started getting to a few more conferences, which was really nerve-wracking, still is, to be honest. And from there, I then found out that one of the things I was most passionate about was security, privacy, anonymity. I've actually considered implanting silver foil under my head as a permanent hat. I think aluminium in the brain is not a good thing, so I haven't done it yet. I'll wait for somebody else to try it out first. But all of these things kind of culminated to me starting to work for Auth0. So I started working there as a developer evangelist back in September. Developer evangelist is still a bit of a strange word. People think I'm going to stand up here and look like a priest and tell you exactly what you should believe. But in fact, what it is that I evangelize developers back to Auth0. So because I love working and meeting the community, I want to find out what problems you have and then be able to take that back to Auth0 or any other company for that matter and try and make your lives easier. So I'm not here to preach. I'm here to have fun, to share some thoughts, meet you afterwards, get some good questions, and see if there's any other ways that your problems can be solved more easily. But the problem I want to solve today is security. So in the beginning, we had the whole, our security is developed organically. Has anybody ever said that to anybody or ever heard that? We just develop it organically. We don't really have a process for doing security. It just happens. Magically. Security is magic. And from there, we want to work out how we can do better. So we'll have a look at the organic method. We'll look at ways of doing it better. And then I want to finish off with how you can just not care. So let's start having a look at the organically. So it all started organically. We had a user, and we have a website. We've got this cloud thing in the middle, and the user wants to request something from a server. And the server returns a login page, and the user passes the credentials in, and then it goes off to a database to make sure that your username and password are correct. And assuming they are, it'll then send a response back to the server, and the server can then render the success page. We've all seen that, right? How many of us have written a login form like that? How many of us have written a login form system like that in the last year? There's still too many hands. We shouldn't have to care about that. Because the problem now is somebody comes along and says, let there be scale. Our servers are really slow. We've got too many users. We need to shard our database, whatever the problem is that we're trying to solve. So we bring in 3 extra servers, another database. The databases talk to the servers, and the databases need to synchronize with each other. And then, because we don't have state anymore, because we were storing it all in a session cookie on the one server, we now bring in a memcache or some kind of caching system at the top there, so we can share the session across multiple servers. And they've all got to communicate there. And then we decide we're going to create an API to make our lives easier. So the API needs to be able to be to know whether or not the servers are allowed to talk to it. So there's an authentication process there. So the API now also needs to talk to the database to see not just if the user's logged in, but is this server allowed to talk to me? Is there a machine-to-machine authentication authorization here? And then, of course, because we've got an API, why not use REST to talk directly from the client to the API? So now the API needs to talk to the database in a second way to work out whether the client's allowed to talk to it. And somebody else says, well, we've got all this database of users, but we've got an Active Directory store. Why don't we allow our people to log in either via single sign-on or just the same username and password that we've already got in Active Directory? So we then connect all the servers to Active Directory, and we connect the API to Active Directory, and then the Active Directory synchronizes with the database, which synchronizes with the other database. And then somebody says, well, we've got an API, let's do the mobile app as well. So the mobile app now talks to the API. And that's just authentication and authorization. We're not even passing data around yet. So it gets complicated really quickly. Has anybody ever seen anything grow to this scale and pulled their hair out? About 10%, yeah. So that's just for the authentication, the identity management. We haven't even looked at, let's get some data from the API. All we're saying is, am I allowed to talk to the API? It's complicated. So how can we do it better? Let's take a step back. We've got all of this mess just here on the right-hand side. What can we do to clean that up? So let's take that all out, and we'll add in an identity provider. It's a single solution. You can host your own. You can grab one like a cloud storage, cloud solution like Auth0 or Cognito or any of the others. But you grab yourself an identity provider whose sole job is to manage identity. How many people here work for a company that produces identity software? One. So that person at the back there is the only person in this room who should write a login form. Because your businesses don't make more money by having better login. They make more money by providing the service that your business provides better. How many people here write their own merchant service, like I want to process this credit card, so I'm going to talk to the bank and bring the money out and do it all within your own system and you're PCI compliant? We don't do that anymore. There are 2 people. Do you work for money processing company? Or you do? Okay. So in the same way as we've got the identity provider at the back doing login, we've got the person who does money management transactions doing the money side of things. But we don't do that anymore. We use Stripe or we use PayPal. So externalize it. Whatever tool you're going to use. It doesn't need to be Auth0 if you don't want to, but just externalize that. Don't worry about it. Don't make it your problem. So from this point here, we can stop logging in directly to our servers. Our servers don't need to know our credentials. We log directly into the identity server. The identity server can then tell our servers who's just logged in. And again, our servers then don't need to know the passwords. It's our risk profile is a lot lower now because we're not storing this sensitive information. The API can also use those same tokens, like the access tokens from the identity provider. You can synchronize between users within a database. You can allow the database to know extra profile information about the user, but still we don't have the credentials. You can even synchronize with Active Directory. A lot of identity providers will allow you to back off an existing Azure AD or any of the user management systems as a login provider, or even just as a user store for the username and passwords. And then you've got your identity provider that manages all of that token generation and management. So let's take a step in and look at how token passing actually works and what is OpenID Connect and OAuth. How does this process work so that you don't need to know anything about who the user is until you have this token? So we have the identity provider here. At the top there on our server, we have a client ID and a client secret. So there's 2 different ways that you can do authentication or like management between your APIs and web servers and the identity provider, depending on how you hash the information. You can either use an HMAC or an RSA hashing. With HMAC, you're going to have a shared key, and with RSA, you're going to have a public-private key. They're different use cases. It's beyond the scope of this talk, but if you want to know more about that, come talk to me afterwards about why you would choose one over the other. So in this particular case, we're going to have a shared key process. So we have the shared key on the server, and we have the client ID. So when the user comes across the server now, what the server does is it doesn't redirect or doesn't generate a login page. It sends the client ID back to the server with a 302 redirect. So your browser now gets redirected to the identity provider, and the identity provider creates the login form, thanks to our gentleman in the back there. So this login form is generated based on the client ID that's passed to the identity provider. So the identity provider knows which client is trying to log in. I'm trying to log into bendechrai.com, therefore I'm going to provide this login form. So I then type in my credentials, I pass them back to the identity provider. The identity provider will then look up my username and password and make sure they match. And assuming they do, it'll generate an authorization code, which it then passes back to the browser, which the browser then automatically redirects back to the server. So all the user has now seen is a login page. They've submitted it. For all intents and purposes, it looks no different to any other kind of login experience. But in the background, your server now has the authorization code that has come back with that login process. And using that authorization code and the private key, or the shared password, rather, it sends those in a server-to-server communication. So that's the secure part there. Remember that the user area, the browser, is totally untrusted. We can't trust what comes through, which is why we use the authorization code to then pass back with the shared password, so the identity provider can say, well, I know that you are definitely bendechrai.com because you've just given me the shared password that only you and I should know. And you've given me this authorization code, which I previously passed back to a browser because John Smith just logged in. Therefore, I'm going to create a token for John Smith down at the bottom here. I'm going to send that token back to you. So the identity provider is now sure that John Smith is the person who logged in, is sure that bendechrai.com is the server that this person wants to log into, and has just provided that token back to the server. But again, from the user experience perspective, all they saw was a login form. And you don't have to worry about any of the password hashing, migration issues in the future, securing your databases from that risk, obviously. You still want to secure your databases. That's essentially how it works in the background. So the changes that we see here now is that we're passing the credentials directly to the server, which means that this token that gets generated once by the web server, if anybody here was in Sam Bellin's talk yesterday, a couple of hands, so he was talking about how you can take one token and you can chain it down the line. So you can have a token that's generated for a particular user and you can provide it to any other entity. And those entities can then trust that that information is correct. With cookies, for example, you can't do that. If my browser sends a cookie to bendechrai.com and bendechrai.com wants to then make a request to api.bendechrai.com, you can't really pass that cookie along. You can sort of, but it's tricky. And there's potential backdoors and vulnerabilities that could happen because you're essentially managing these tokens very manually. And then you've got domain issues like cores and all the rest of it. But in this case here, because you've got a single token, you can provide that to any other system within your ecosystem, and that token can be used to either assert who you are or assert what you're allowed to do. So an identity token or an access token. The access token can also be used directly between the server and the API. The identity provider doesn't need to be involved because access tokens, especially when you start looking at JSON web tokens, they are self-validating. They have a signature, which means that you're allowed to, or you're able to determine whether or not the token has been modified. So two systems can talk to each other and share a JSON web token without the identity provider even needing to be consulted about whether or not it's valid. The login from the mobile, similarly, will just go directly to the identity provider, and then they'll be able to use the same token or a different token still for that user to talk directly to the API. So now we don't have that issue of logging in to the API for REST-based or whatever kind of SOAP, whatever you want to use, connections to your APIs. You're still using this single token. So how can we just not care? So this part is where I'm going to sit down. I'm going to try and do a demo, because we all love live demos, yeah? Good. So I'm going to do a demo around Auth0, naturally, because that's the product that I'm most familiar with. Has anybody here used Auth0 before? A few hands. One of the things, so before I even started working for them, one of the reasons why I started using it as a product is because the documentation is really quite awesome. But once you've created your application, it almost gives you a step-by-step, almost copy and paste way of setting up your application really quickly. And for example, once you've created an application, you get this list here that says, what are you integrating with? You can just click on it and it'll take you directly to the documentation. I've actually had people come to me and say that they have used Auth0 documentation to get their Cognito integration working. Because apparently Cognito's documentation is not as good, I think. Is that politically correct to say? All right, so let's have a look at some code. So naturally I'm going to do it in PHP, because we all like PHP here. And I've got three code bases to look at. So we've got the application, which is kind of like the client. So in this case, I'm going to create a web application. You could obviously use it for native mobile application as well. As far as I'm aware, you can't write native mobile applications in PHP. If anybody knows of a way of doing that, I'd love to know. So we will do a web application. So if we have a look here, we've got very simple applications. So I've used Composer. And basically, the only thing I've said is I require Auth0 PHP. And then you do Composer install, and you're pretty much ready to go. So the main thing that we have in here is 3 files. Auth0 PHP, which is kind of like the bootstrap. That's where the configuration stuff goes. We've got index.php, which is like the index.php. And we've got login and logout. In order to get this going, we have the Auth0 file. Is that bright enough for the people at the back? It's readable? Yes, I'm getting nodding, but no shaking. So maybe you can't hear me either. So we're pulling in autoload, and I basically create a new auth0 object, and in there I've got all of my configuration. So the thing that I know that I want to do is when you log in, remember how we did the redirect from the identity provider back to the server? So we need to define there, that's where we're going. So localhost port 3000 is where this app is going to run. So once I've logged in to auth0, it's going to redirect me back to this application. We've got the audience. So the audience at the moment, if anybody's used OpenID Connect in the past, you'll probably be familiar with the user info endpoint. So that's basically a pretty standard path on the identity provider's URL, which gives you information about the user. A couple of other things. So the domain that I'm connecting to for authentication, the client ID and secret need to go in there. So let's generate those. So I've basically just logged into auth0.com, and I've gone to the Applications tab on the left. We're going to create an application, and I'm going to call it IPC, or My App IPC, just IPC. If I can find my mouse. We want it to be a regular web application. Hit Create. And this is then where we see that screen that I was showing you before, the quick start. So you can go in and you can choose whatever technology. I'm currently tethered to my mobile because the conference Wi-Fi is also slow. There we go. So here you can choose whichever technology you're using, and it'll give you a step-by-step guide on how to integrate. But I'm just going to step straight into the settings page where we have the client ID and the secret. So I'll copy the client ID and plonk that in here. And the secret. That's it. So if we just have a quick look at the index.php to see what happens in there. It's not the prettiest. I haven't used a templating language. I'm sure a lot of you are cringing, but it's a demo, okay? So we're pulling in auth0.php again so that we've got the configuration. We're getting so user info was already created in auth0 as an instance of the auth0 object. We're getting the user information out of that. So the way, and this is the standard class that comes from auth0, the way that works is you'll either get something that evaluates to false-ish if there's no user info. So if there's no user info, we're just going to display the login link. Otherwise, we're going to go through and just print out some information so that you can see what's going on behind the scenes. I wouldn't recommend perhaps dumping all of this out in your production application, but we'll have a look what's going on. So we'll have a logout button just for convenience. I'm going to print out the name of the person who's logged in, show the image, show what we're actually getting back in the user info variable there, and then also just dump out the session, because the library will put some stuff into the session just for convenience. Let's see how that looks. So we've got our login button up here. So the first thing that happens is we get a failure. Something went wrong. So this is where the documentation starts helping you automatically. It's telling us that the URL, callback URL mismatch has occurred. And basically this happens because if I'm an identity provider and Anastasia has a website and she wants to use my identity provider services for people to log in. And then, what's your name? Alice. Comes along and says, I'm going to use the same key but a different callback URL to hijack the information and pretend that somebody's logged in as me. So I need to know who Anastasia is happy to have as a callback URL. That's an extra level of security. So that's something we need to set up again in auth0. So if we jump over here and go down a little. So there's all sorts of other things you can do in here. You can like change your colors and your logo and all the rest of it. But essentially the main thing we want to do here, and I'm going to copy and paste because typing and talking at the same time is always a mistake. And we're going to paste localhost port 3000 in there. So that's, once I've logged in, that's where I want to be redirected back to. Now, the other thing we also need to define is where people are allowed to load the login page from. So the origin. So in this case here, I'm just going to say localhost port 3000 is a site that's allowed to use this instance of auth0, this tenancy, as a login system. So if I go down and hit save, and then we try and log in again, it should just work. Let's go back, refresh, just in case. Find the mouse cursor again. So we have a default logo. We've got the name of the application that we want to log in as. We've automatically out of the box got Facebook and Google login. There are others you can turn on and off as well. But what I'm going to do, I don't actually have an account yet because we only just created it. So I'm going to go over to sign up, and I'm going to create an account. Now, the next steps, this will only ever happen the first time you log in, or if the permissions that the applications wants to get changes. And in this case, we know that the application running on port 3000 wants access to my profile. If we just jump back to the code very quickly. You can see here we wanted the scope to be OpenID, so this is like we want to know who the person is, but also profile, which is basically a request to get more information about the user. Things like the name and the photo and email addresses. So it's just double checking with me here, and if you've ever logged in via Twitter or Facebook into any other application, you'll have seen similar things. This application wants access to post to your wall, for example. So these are all different types of scopes. At the moment, the only scope we want is profile access. I'm happy to allow that, so I click on the tick button. And this is now where it redirects back to port 3000 on localhost. If you look very quickly, you'll probably notice it happening in the address bar there. And there's a code that comes through. So that's the authentication, the authorization code, which the application then sends back to auth0 in order to get the token out. So now we have the token, and we can see my name according to the application, the user account that I just created is just ben@dechrai.com. It's because I didn't provide any other kind of name, so auth0 assumes email is name. It's gotten my photo from somewhere, I don't know where. Actually, it's from Gravatar. There you go. So I've got a Gravatar account and it's pulled that out automatically for me. And then here's the information. So that's the information that came out of the auth0 object when we had the user info. So automatically we've got there a sub, so that's the subject. This, every time I log in, using the same account, that string will always be the same. So that's what you can use in your application as an identifier for the user who's just logged in. Got the nickname, name, picture, and updated at. And then down at the bottom we have what's in the session information. So this is potentially a little more interesting for us. So we've got an access token, and we've got an ID token. If we take this ID token, copy that, and paste it into... So jwt.io is a pretty useful tool for looking at JSON Web Tokens. So I've just pasted that in there, but it's invalid because I've got a little bit of extra text at the top here that I don't need. Oops, too much. So you can see now it's not pink anymore. It's been validated, and we've got bits of information there. So we can see it's a JSON Web Token using the RSA SHA-256 hashing algorithm, and the information that came out that we saw in the previous web page. This has all just been given to us for free automatically by auth0 as soon as we logged in. And then we've got the signature at the bottom. Now you'll notice at the moment that the audience is essentially like a base64 URL encoded type string. It's not really very useful or usable. And also, if we just jump back to this page here, the access token, this is an opaque access token, so it's just a string. It doesn't really tell us very much. And because we're automatically just asking for user information, as opposed to trying to connect to any other kind of databases, it's not giving us more than we actually need. So if we change this now, we want to, I mentioned before that I had an API that runs on a different port. So we have, if I can get the copy and paste to work, we have a new application that I'm going to create. In fact, it's an API that we want to create. So we jump over to the API section. On the left here, we've got the API tab. I'm going to just create an API. I'm going to call it IPC, and it's going to be on port 3001. So the issue here is that I was testing this demo before, and I already have one that's on the same, so you can't have the same identifier, because the identifier there is actually what auth0 uses to work out which API you're trying to authenticate to, so you can't have two with the same URL. So what we'll do instead is we'll just jump over to the API list here. We already have the API, so here's the one that I created before on port 3001. So let's just edit this one instead. rather than going from scratch. So the next thing that you need to do once you've created an API is you need to make sure that, so you had your application and the identity provider communicating machine to machine. So you need to allow that to happen. So under the machine-to-machine applications, we'll see that we already have, okay, so we've got the new client here. We need to authorize this API to accept tokens from the IPC client that we just created, the application that we're working on at the moment. That's all we need to do. So the next thing we need to do is edit our client to want to talk to port 3001. And in order to do that, we come in here. So at the moment, the audience is the user info here. And all I've done is I've just changed that to say the audience is now the application on port 3001. And then the final piece of the puzzle is to look at the application that's actually running on port 3001. And we're going to look at the index.php. So this API is basically going to take the access token that's provided to us and tell us about it. That's all it does at the moment. But obviously, there's no access token that can't tell us anything about it. And this is just to show that passing that token along can still be verified. So the only thing we need to do down here is that client secret that we had for the application, because it's a shared secret setup here. If we go back to this application here, this is the client secret that we want to copy in. That should work. Now let's log out and log back in again because we need to generate a new token. One of my least favorite parts about doing live demos is straining to see what's going on behind me. So let's go to the top, log out, log in again. Now this time we're being asked to authenticate again. We wouldn't normally need to do this, except the audience has changed. So we're getting a different kind of token now. So it's just verifying that I'm still happy to share my profile information, which I am. And once it returns back, and you'll notice that I didn't have to provide my username and password because Auth0 has got a cookie with me. So I'm still logged in with Auth0, and it's able to then automatically pass me through to the application. So for all intents and purposes, it looks very similar. I don't know what it wants to translate it to. Maybe it can automatically interpret JSON Web Tokens, I'm not sure. You'll notice the ID token here now looks like a JSON Web Token. In fact, it's down here for convenience. So before we had that 30, 40-ish character string, the opaque string, that really wasn't of any use. It was just something that allowed us to talk to other APIs. If we look at this in JSON Web, JWT.io, we'll now notice that it's no longer an identity token. It's still a JSON Web Token using the same algorithm, but we have some different information down here now. So we've got the issuer at the top. That's the Auth0 account that we used. We've got the subject, which is the account identifier that we saw on the previous page. The audience, so localhost 3001 is now allowed to use this information. User info is added in there automatically because we wanted the profile information. And then we've got issued at expiry and some other tokens and scope information. So now if I use this to, let's just jump over to Postman. So if we now make a request, wrong one, headers. So I'm going to make a request up here to port 3001, index.php, and we're going to pass in access token as a header. So normally what you do is you'd use the authorization header and pass in a bearer token, but at the moment all we want to do is just really grab a token and process it and see what's going on. So I'm going to paste that access token that we just received. I'm going to send that through. And if I scroll down, we should theoretically, no cookie for me, body. There we go. So this is now the API running on port 3001, which has been able to take the token, verify that it's valid. Verify that it's valid? That's what you always verify, isn't it? And then extract the information out of it. And that is simply this code here. So we get the JWT verifier. We're also using a cache handler just to store a bit of information. And then we just say access token is verify and decode, get the access token out of the header, and then print it out. So in 2 lines, plus vendor stuff, your API can now get access information from the application that needs to access the API. How are we doing for time? 32. So the other steps that I was hoping to show is basically integrating this with Laravel, which would show you something along these lines. So we've got a public API running on port 3002. Lost my mouse again. And if we send a request through to that, we've got hello from a public endpoint. And then with a private endpoint at the moment, because the token is invalid, it gives us wrong number of segments. If we paste the token in there, then by modifying about 7 different files, and I basically just followed the Laravel instructions on the website, I was able to then authenticate somebody through Laravel. So the key, I hope, that you can take away from this is, again, whether or not it's Auth0 or another identity provider, the amount of code that I had to write in order to get authentication working within those two APIs there is very thin. It's a very light touch. So if you, within your organization, within your pet project, side project, whatever it is, if you are able to do away with having to worry about any of the identity, any of the login, any of the password management, two-factor authentication, social login, Active Directory integration, whatever it is you're trying to do, if you don't have to worry about any of that and you can just use a third-party system or host something like Keycloak in your own environment, but that's kind of almost self-managed, it reduces the overhead that you have within your team to work on other more exciting things. You can, in fact, one of the biggest benefits that I ever heard of was Atlassian recently moved over to an identity provider, and they had 22, I think it was 22 or 13 members of staff who were working on their login system full time. And they all moved over to work on feature management and bug remediation. So their business benefit to their customers was able to ramp up so much faster because they didn't have developers working on what was not one of their core requirements, because they managed to get another company who it is their core requirement. So I hope that's given you a bit of insight into how you can not care about security so much, make it somebody else's problem. But if you are making it somebody else's problem, make sure that somebody else actually cares about that problem. So with that said, we have minus 29 seconds, I believe, to go. Minus 2 minutes to go. Thank you for sticking with me for the extra 2 minutes. I'm going to be around for the whole of the lunch break if you want to come and ask me questions. I'll take questions now, but I understand if your stomachs are rumbling. Conference attending is a very hunger-producing activity. So if you do need to go, please do. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please come and chat to me. Thanks.